Human, all too human, a reply to normative history and the communist essence of the proletariat by Gilles Dauve, originally published 2000. This text from Endnotes number 1. It is for the reader to judge whether, as theory communists think, when insurrections die explains what happened by what didn't happen. We believe that in that article we set out first what proletarians actually did, and then what they weren't able or didn't want to do. Quote, yet no lessons but negative ones can be drawn from all these undertakings. The struggles of the German proletariat from 1919 to 1923. The lesson learned was how not to proceed. End quote. From Paul Maddox's Auto Rule in the German labor movement. To jump back and forth between yesterday and tomorrow has its dangers, but it is more illuminating than the explanation according to which every social movement ineluctably ends up where it is driven by its epic. Quote, mankind thus inevitably sets itself only such tasks as it is able to solve, since closer examination will always show that the problem itself arises only when the material conditions for solution are already present, or at least in the course of formation. End quote, from Marx, a contribution to the critique of political economy. So be it. It remains for us to determine these conditions and which goal they correspond to. Otherwise, we limit ourselves to demonstrating how what had to happen, happened. To reconstruct 200 years of class struggles from the knowledge which we now have of them is not without interest. But what privilege permits the observer in the year 2000 to know that his standpoint is ultimately the right one? Nothing can guarantee that in 2050, after 50 more years of capitalism, an even more broad-ranging overview will establish for X plus Y reasons the ways in which the proletarians of the year 2000, and with them TC, along with Gilles Dauve, remained historically constrained by the limits of their times, and thus that communism wasn't actually in the offering in the year 2000 any more than it was in 1970 or 1919, but that now a new period is ushering itself in, allowing us to genuinely grasp the past from the new, proper viewpoint. Nothing guarantees it, except the certainty of the opening of a totally different historical epoch towards the end of the 20th century. To be sure, the conviction of TC is well buttressed and argued. Despite everything, however, it is not a caricature to read a new version of the final crisis in this vision of a phase in which proletarian and capital are supposedly from now on face to face, enabling proletarians to call into question their own existence as a class, thus posing the question of communism in all its nakedness. More than a mere theoretical position, it is this way of situating oneself in relation to the world, this ultimatism, which is questionable. Capitalism will only be non-reproducible the day when proletarians cease producing it. There is no objective limit to a social system. Proletarians only give themselves tasks that they are able to and want to resolve. Theory communiste steers clear of the conditional and subjunctive models. However, just as one of the traits of language is projection into the future, man is also characterized by his capacity to think what could be, to reinterpret the past on the basis of collective choices made by social groups, and thus to consider what could have been. History is a conjunction of possibilities and wills. Freedom consists not in being able to do anything one wants, but in wanting what one can do, which is another way of saying men make their own history, but under circumstances directly encountered, given and transmitted from the past. Circumstances which they don't invent, but which it is within their powers to modify. Will, freedom, man, these are all words which disturb the theoretical rigor of TC. Unfortunately, to refuse all concepts which are exterior to capitalism is to condemn oneself to thinking nothing but capitalism. The fate of capitalism is not intelligible on the basis of capitalism alone. To reject all concepts which refer to an outside of the capital wage labor structure amounts to building a model that is irrefutable because it refers only to itself. What would be the use in a proletarian structuralism? We don't postulate an irreducible ahistorical human nature which ends up bursting the capitalist fetter. Underneath labor lies activity, stated in an article in La Banquise. Idealism, everything depends on the underneath. It is false to conceive of capitalism as a prison from which one glorious dawn will emerge a virtuality which today is enclosed. That would presuppose an always already existing positivity, constrained by capital and waiting to escape. What exists, on the contrary, neither anterior nor exterior to capital, but consubstantial with it, and as indispensable condition of its functioning, is a universal scope of living labor, from which it feeds every day. Not in the sense in which labor is presumed as the essential characteristic of man defined as homo faber. More simply, proletarians are not bovines. A man is not put to work like an animal is. The most manual occupation demands more than mere expenditure of muscle, a grasp, an anticipation of the gesture, a savoir-faire not eliminated by Taylorism, an acquired skill which the worker can then transmit. This faculty includes a representation of what other workers do and are, including if they live 10,000 kilometers away. The horse can refuse the work demanded of it, kill its master, escape and finish its days free, but it cannot initiate another form of life, which reorganizes the life of the former master as well. Capital is only capital because it exploits, not only the product of labor, but that which is human, a power to work, an energy which is always collective, which capital manages but can never completely dominate, which it depends on, and which can put it into crisis or even revolution. Proletarianization is not the loss of some prior existing thing, but the exploitation of human capacity. Alienation is only transhistorical to the extent that capitalism recapitulates a multi-millenarian past. Something becomes other. This is certainly one of the characteristics of wage labor. The latter affects a dispossession not of an undefinable humanity, but of time constrained. Energy used, acts forced by capital, which is thereby valorized. What the proletarian loses every day is not a strip of some eternal nature, but a force of life, a social capacity which the beast of burden does not have at its disposal, and which is thus a reality internal to the wage relation. It's not a question of introducing a human dimension into the analysis, but of seeing that it is to be found there. A fundamental contribution of the German-Dutch left and its descendants is to have emphasized this. Quote, if the worker is, even from the economic point of view, more than a machine, it is because he produces for the capitalist more than he costs him, and above all, because in the course of his labor he manifests a creativity, the capacity to produce ever more and ever better than any productive class of previous periods ever possessed. When that capitalist treats the proletariat as livestock, he learns quickly to his expense that livestock cannot fulfill the function of the worker, because the productivity of overexploited workers decreases rapidly. This is the deep root of the contradictions of the modern system of exploitation and the historical reason of its failure, of its incapacity to stabilize itself. End quote, from Socialism au Barbarie, number 1, 1949. Socialism au Barbarie, like councilism, reduced the generic character, which is the foundation of wage labor, to the dimension of its management. This fact, however, cannot blind us to that which these currents, which reflect the struggles for self-activity and autonomy against the bosses, bureaucracy, and the state, brought to light. It is the proletariat which capitalism places in a situation of universality. The important thing is not the proletarians produce riches, which for the most part impoverish us, but that they themselves are the ever more totalizing but never total commodification of activity in life. Since a proletarian is a commodity which produces all the others, he contains them all, holds the key to his own exploitation, and in negating himself as commodified being, can revolutionize the world of the commodity. No previous exploited class lived a similar potentiality. In fact, even if they died from overwork, the slave, the serf, the peasant under the yoke of the corvée and tax, the artisan and the worker before the Industrial Revolution, were only ferociously exploited in one part of their existence, a large portion of which remained outside the control of the dominant class. The serf's vegetable garden wasn't of interest to the lord. Modern proletarians produce a totality of material life. They lose it, then they receive it back in the form of the commodity and the spectacle. And this takes the form of the global circulation of goods and labor. It's for this reason that capitalism was theorized 150 years ago as a realization, if not the completion, of a double tendency of the universalization of humanity and its alienation. Between 1830 and 1848, a minority perceives society at a limit point. Proletarians can only reappropriate the totality of the conditions of life, not only to achieve self-activity, but also merely to safeguard their very existence. The unannounced revolution will use productive forces, but won't be a revolution of the producers. Technology is only valid as a flowering of individuals with a supersession of professional capacities. Quote, now the isolation of individuals and each person's particular way of gaining his livelihood have themselves become accidental. Thus, while the fugitive serfs only wish to have full scope to develop and assert those conditions of existence which were already there, and hence, in the end, only arrived at free labor, the proletarians, if they are to assert themselves as individuals, have to abolish hitherto prevailing conditions of their existence, which has, moreover, been that of all society up to then, namely labor. Thus they find themselves directly opposed to the form in which hitherto the individuals of which society consists and has given themselves collective expression, that is, a state. In order, therefore, to assert themselves as individuals, they must overthrow the state. End quote. From Marx and Engels, The German Ideology. Beyond the glaring contradiction between an increasing production of wealth, which impoverishes its producers, the more radical perceive a historic opening through the contradiction of labor, which is now the only possible, but, as we see, negative form of self-activity. From the clash between artisans, a new figure could emerge beyond the creator artist and the proletarian servant of the machine, thanks to commodified labor, which was unattached and indifferent to its content, but collective. It became possible to envisage association and the supersession of the wage form, still too recent to appear natural. The proletariat is thus conceived as that which will compose another society. It already configures a kind of society, since classes dissolve themselves in it. It sucks in artisans and peasants, attracts a proportion of intellectuals, and doesn't form a block or entity, but expresses a social decomposition, or recomposition, as revolutionaries hope. Proletarians experience unemployment, poverty, uprooting, the breakdown of the family, of customs, of identities, of values, and at the same time, act collectively, as seen in insurrections, Chartism, trade unions, Tristan's Union Ouvrière, Luddism too, of which the latter trade unions gave the falsified image of a brute force, spontaneous but limited. The proletariat before 1848 was an ensemble disaggregated enough to criticize itself, but still communitarian enough to want to struggle, and by the breaking down of barriers between worker, non-worker, artisan and laborer, manual and intellectual, accede to a free association. The organized workers' movement subsequently both took on and denied this heritage, and the communist horizon has been fixed on sociology for more than a century. Under the weight of the epoch, Marx himself, although aiming for a description of the characteristics of communist society, considered it increasingly on the basis of capitalism, and by dint of criticizing political economy, became enclosed within it. What is the interest in scientifically proving exploitation, instead of exposing how exploitation exploits that which can produce communism? It's not a case of opting for the young Marx against the old Marx, but of understanding that the young Marx contains the old Marx a lot more than the old Marx contains the young Marx. Thus, the intellectual involution echoes a historical stabilization. The perspective is impoverished in the International Working Men's Association, or the Commune, when compared to that of the middle of the century, which the author of the 1844 manuscripts synthesized the best, but which others had also expressed. The revolution didn't occur around 1848, and it would be vain to expect that computerization will finally render historically necessary, in the year 2000, that which large-scale mechanized industry was supposed to achieve before 1914, or nascent automation after 1960. What is true is that every profound reorganization of the productive system materially impoverishes the workers, but also dispossesses them of a relative mastery over the work, and unleashes resistance and revolts, often conservative, but revolutionary perhaps. The calling into question of capitalism by the forms of wage labor opens up a path of rupture of the wage condition. Each time, nothing guarantees that a communist movement will be able or want to take advantage of it, but the possibility is there, which makes the proletariat the overthrowing class. A hypothesis: we are living in a new charnel epoch in which capitalism is able to create pools of profit for itself, technically innovate and multiply consumer goods, create unemployment and/or income, calm riots, but not unify the global society of generalized labor at the very moment in which the latter becomes inessential. From the fetid cellars of Lille or Manchester in 1840, to the living rooms of council tower blocks where the VCR has pride of place. The problem remains how to put wage earners to work if they are profitable and what to do with them if they are not. At one extreme, in China, 100 million uprooted ex-rurals which the capitalist city won't be able to integrate. At the other end of the chain, in Seine Saint-Denis, in Paris, school until 22 years old, training schemes, insignificant precarious jobs, benefits. Between the two, the United States. For Emmanuel Todd, the biggest success of the American system is production as anti-economic. The question isn't whether there is no way out of the situation for capital, but whether it reopens a way out for the proletariat as a class, not of workers, but of the critique of work. The limit of capital is that it is unable to do without labor, which it indeed generalizes, making millions of beings enter into wage labor at the same time as it reduces labor to a negligible role. To remedy this, thinkers such as Andre Gores propose a delinking of money from labor, in order to accord to everybody a share in consumption, whether they have participated in production or not. Such a society is impossible. Even if it were 10 times more automated, our world would still rest upon labor. Proletarians will remain the necessary evil of capitalism. A question: is it possible to pass from the moment where capital refuses many proletarians, in particular young ones, to the refusal of this world and its labor by proletarians, particularly lots of young ones? What will be done by these, quote, masses resulting from the drastic dissolution of society, mainly in the middle estate, that form the proletariat? By proclaiming the dissolution of the hereto existing world order, the proletariat merely proclaims the secret of its own existence, for it is, in fact, the dissolution of that world order. By demanding the negation of private property, the proletariat merely raises it to the rank of a principle of society that society has made the principle of the proletariat. What, without its own cooperation, is already incorporated in it as a negative result of society. End quote. From Marx, a contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. On the basis of what he had in front of his eyes, i.e. nascent industrialization, Marx theorized a period to come of dislocation of the classes, which was simultaneously the effect of a profound social crisis and the conscious action of proletarians. For him, the proletariat of 1844, but also 100 or 200 years later, is the ensemble of categories having in common that they live only from the sale of their labor power, whether they are in work or without it, partially employed, precarious, or protected by a statute, but susceptible, if not a brother or daughter, to falling into a fragile category. The proletariat exists as dissolution of classes in the sense that it is and affects this dissolution. It is both the product and the process of this dissolution, by a revolution, in which, further, the proletariat rids itself of everything that still clings to it from its previous position in society. It is not a question of it forming a bloc like an army against another, but that it puts into practice a negation which is already going beyond individualism as well as massification. Quote, standing over against these productive forces, we have the majority of the individuals from whom these forces have been wrested away, and who, robbed thus of all real-life content, have become abstract individuals, but who are, however, only by this fact put into a position to enter into relation with one another as individuals. The communal relationship into which the individuals of a class entered, and which was determined by their common interests against a third party, was always a community to which these individuals belonged only as average individuals, only insofar as they lived within the conditions of existence of their class, a relationship in which they participated not as individuals but as members of a class. The community of revolutionary proletarians, on the other hand, who take their conditions of existence and those of all members of society under their control, it is just the reverse. It is as individuals that the individuals participate in it. It is just this combination of individuals, assuming the advanced stage of modern productive forces, of course, which puts the conditions of the free development and movement of individuals under their control, conditions which were previously abandoned to chance and had won an independent existence over against the separate individuals just because of their separation as individuals, and because of the necessity of their combination. End quote from Marx, The German Ideology. According to Theorie Communiste, quote, the proletarian of the young Marx is the personal individual for whom the previous social determinations have become a matter of contingency, and it is the situation itself which is posed as revolutionary." End quote. However, this proletarian evoked by Marx is more than an individual, as he shares, in his head and his actions, his fate with millions of others. Is he so individual, this individual who is weighed down by historical constraint, this being who is endlessly excluded from production, then coercively re-included, and by the same token who, because his condition doesn't enclose him in a factory, an occupation, or a particular place, is able to do what the CGT metal worker proved himself to be incapable of, to pass from one category to another, not to think of himself one-sidedly as worker or out of work, to manifest a certain fluidity, a freedom. Proletarians can fight exploitation, either to merely impose some limits upon it or to bring an end to it by producing communist social relations. How does the link between the two operate? Even the most resolved and most autonomous movement will only challenge society if it manifests a practical demand for another life. In a word, if its acts contain or acquire a universal dimension. The communist revolution is precisely the moment of fusion between the struggle against exploitation and the struggle against alienation. No historical dialectic can deliver the key to this in advance.